Topic we have going is what learning and memory are, and in kind of the kind of regular life or the lay world that we live in, sometimes we use these terms interchangeably. Okay. But for an academic purposes, what I want to do is differentiate when a psychologist is talking about learning from what we're talking about when we're talking about memory. All right. Because when a psychologist is talking about learning, we're not necessarily talking about what we're doing here in the classroom. What we're talking about is a change in behavior. And yes, of course, in the classroom and stuff, I hope that you can take what you learn here and adapt a behavior, do something new with it, change your life, those types of things. But that's not necessarily when we're talking in psychology what we mean by learning. Learning for psychologists is a change in behavior, whether you do a behavior more or you do a behavior less. Memory is more like what we're doing in this classroom. A memory is the development of knowledge. And so it's more analogous to what we're actually doing in the classroom. It's understanding, it's integrating memory into previous knowledge, it's developing new types of knowledge and memories so that we can have some acknowledgement of our understanding of the world. But as we know, memory and knowledge don't always equate to a change in behavior. So, for example, we'll taking we'll be taking algebra in college, change the way you fix breakfast or you go and do your job. And I always hear, well, I never used algebra in my life, and whatnot. And so did that actually change a behavior? Well, not necessarily. Now, there's parts of doing algebra and that have to do with analytics and logic thinking that we really don't see when we're trying to figure out A plus B equals C. But that's a subject for another time. Or is what learning about Vygotsky or those things actually going to change your behavior? Probably not necessarily. Um, so the point being is knowledge and memory doesn't always equate to changes in behavior, and that's why we kind of separate the two. So the first topic that we're going to talk about is actual behavior and learning. How is actual behavior changed based on experience? Okay. And this really started with what's called the behaviorist movement, especially here in the United States. This really took off in the United States. It probably dominated American psychology for around 50, 60 years in the 20th century. And it really did set the tone for even research we do today, because we'll see that when people started thinking about memory and knowledge and cognition, they're going to use the experimental techniques that the behaviorists, excuse me, the behaviorists used to study even things like cognition and knowledge and emotions. Okay. The reason why behaviorism came about, though, is because there was a lot of American psychologists who felt that with the Freudian movement and all of that, that they were kind of setting psychology back into being more of a philosophy than a science. And a lot of the psychologists here in the United States wanted to be respected as scientists, much like in the natural sciences like physics and the what we quote unquote hard sciences. And so the assertions, and this is the little black box here, the assertions of behaviorists is that psychology should only study what is observable. Okay. And I'll give an example of that here in just a minute. The other assertions they made based on the time because at the time evolutionary theory was really taking toll, so there was really no separation between animals and humans other than brain structures and different things like that. But it was they asserted that animal behavior then can be translated into human behavior. So we can do experimentation with animals, and then we can state that what we observed in the animal, it can be observed in the human being, which is also going to lead to their downfall, as we will see. But what I mean by this first one, we only study what is observable, is best represented in this slide right here. Okay. What can we observe, especially at this time in history for the early 20th century? Well, we can observe a stimuli in the environment. So something we present to an organism, and we can observe their behavior, their response. Okay. What we can't observe is everything in between, the thought processes, mental processes, the emotions, the feelings, and all of those things. And so those things are irrelevant. In fact, one of our most hardcore behaviorists, B.F. Skinner, is going to state that consciousness is a byproduct of stimulus response associations. He's going to say it's just kind of this thing that has no meaning. It's just kind of this byproduct. It's kind of like the scum left over after you've spilled the soup out of the can. Okay. And so this is what we're dealing with when we're dealing with the behaviorist movement and when we're talking about learning. Okay, is this idea is what happens when you present a stimulus in the environment? Does it increase an individual's behavior or does it decrease an individual's behavior? And this became what's called SR psychology, or stimulus response psychology. Okay. So coming back to this slide, and we're going to go through each of these individuals because they all kind of have interesting stories that go beyond our explanation of behaviorism. Is there were some people who set up the behaviorist movement. So we'll see that the father of behaviorism and B.F. Skinner, much of their argument of what's called the Behaviorist Manifesto comes from the work of Thorndike and Ebbinghaus. Okay. And so we'll take a look at these two gentlemen as kind of predecessors or predecessors to the behaviorist movement. And then we're going to look at 4 examples of behaviorism. We'll look at Ivan Pavlov, who, if anyone has seen the dog and the bell jokes around, this is that dude. We'll look at John B. Watson, who is actually what is considered the father of behaviorism. He wrote this manifesto saying this is all that psychology should be studying. We'll look at B.F. Skinner. He's the gentleman. He's kind of the poster child of behaviorism. He actually died in late 1986, I believe, and he was still on his deathbed writing a manuscript in support of the behaviorist movement and why psychology shouldn't throw it away, and how the other sciences, such as mental processes, should be something should be cut out. So he's going to be kind of our poster child for this show that we're about to watch, or this scenario that plays out. Now, the main contribution for B.F. Skinner is what's going to be called operant conditioning. So operant meaning you operate. And this is where you get the idea that a child does something good, so you give them a piece of candy, so you reward them, right? And that increases behavior. And then theoretically, if you introduce something negative, such as yelling at a child or spanking a child at one level, that's a punishment. And that theoretically should reduce behavior, okay? And then one of the last people before we leave behaviorism, he's more of a transitional person between behaviorism and something we'll call the cognitive movement, where we reintroduce mental states, is Albert Bandura. And he is going to introduce the idea of social learning, which is going to be a topic. We'll talk about it a little bit more as we move along. But social learning is different than mimicking. Okay. Social learning in human beings is when you observe people's different behaviors and you rearrange them in your mind to make the behavior that you will do in order to accomplish that task. That's different than mimicking, where you're mimicking a specific behavior to accomplish a task. But we'll get more into that here in a little while. And then the person who probably put a nail in the coffin to this whole behaviorist movement is Edward Tolman. And he introduced the idea of mental maps using behaviorist techniques. Okay. So this is just kind of an introduction to kind of what we'll be talking about when we're going through learning. But let's look at first the predeterminants, the people who started or gave the idea of this stimulus response association. Okay. The first one is Thorndike. And I don't know why he chose cats to do experiments on. I don't know about you. I have two. They're little feral cats, and they're not controllable, but he chose them. And everyone has always asked, why did he choose cats? Now, partly, I kind of think the reason he chose cats is if you know a cat, when they feel trapped, they'll want to do anything to get out of that trap. Okay. And if you've ever cornered a cat, you probably ended up with some scratches on your arms or your face or elsewhere. So you'll understand this concept. And I think this is why he used cats. But what he did is he used what he called a cat box. Okay. And he put the cat in here, and there were other stimuli in here. So you can notice that this one has a little lever, and if the kitty pushes on this lever, it's going to open the door and let the cat out. Okay. And what Thorndike wanted to know is how many trials does it take for the cat to learn how to escape the room. Okay. I kind of liken this to, there's those panic room things where people go into panic rooms and they have to figure out how to get out of it. This is kind of the kitty version of that. Okay. And what he found is that he measured it by time. And of course, as you could probably guess, in the first time, it took quite a while for the kitty to figure out, oh, I got to push on this lever to try it. But over successive trials, and this is probably kind of a no duh thing, but at the time, this was actually a very significant finding. It actually put Thorndike on the map as far as scientists are concerned, is over successive trials, the amount of time it took for the kitty to figure out how to get out of the escape box decreased. Okay. And the interesting thing about this is this escape curve um, um, uh, was applicable to other situations. So let's say instead of pulling this lever, he had to push on a lever in the back of the box. So instead of pulling, he had to push. Well, because he learned that pulling with this little blue thing right here opened it before on other trials, it's not much of a jump to say, well, that's a little blue pedal, so let me go play with it. And so that's kind of the idea behind this and that's kind of, but what Thorndike kind of argued is this is kind of how humans learn, because we know that the more often humans do something, the quicker they become at it. Okay. And so this Thorndike was really used as an example of how we can use animal experimentation to then equate into human behavior. Okay. Ebbinghaus, on the other hand, wanted to look at forgetting. Now, this has to do more with memory, um, but this deals with, and so this will get into our conversation when we get to memory and we get to forgetting, but it kind of equates to the same thing. If a stimulus is not in the environment, then over time there's a forgetting lapse. But what Ebbinghaus did that's unique is he came up with nonsense words, like words you've never, that they had no meaning because he didn't want prior learning to interfere with his experiment. And we'll see this when we get into memory tasks and the like about how it's important to not have previous experiences. What you're trying to measure is learning and forgetting. And of course, it's probably a no-duh curve, but again, this also put Ebbinghaus on the map and started the whole investigation into memory and memory processes. Is that, as you can imagine, so you do four sets of, let's say, nonsense word. Well, on the first instance, you're going to get 100% of them right, I hope. I don't know if I could do more than four words, but let's say four words. Okay. But then as time elapses, without repeated exposure of those, this tends to be the forgetting curve. Okay. So, this is a good information for people who cram for studies. Is that if you cram 1 hour before, you'll get probably a 60% on your exam. If you cram for an exam 3 hours, you'll probably get around a 20 to 30% on your exam. So you can use this curve to determine if you're cramming for an exam, how much time you should allot between the rush studying and when you go take the exam. So this curve might be helpful for those who decide to study at the last minute. Okay. All right. Probably someone that most everybody knows or has heard of is Ivan Pavlov. And we'll get more specifics into classical conditioning here in a little while. I just want to give a little bit of background on this individual. Ivan Pavlov is actually a Russian, I can't remember. If he was a medical doctor, he'd be a gastrointestinal doctor, but he wasn't a medical doctor. He was an experimenter that experimented and tried to figure out the gastrointestinal system. And it's surprising to me that he's being rewarded in psychology for developing what we call classical conditioning, because we actually should be thanking him for things like antacids, that how we get food down from here down to our stomach, how we get things like blockages and constipation. He was really the forefront of researchers who really scientifically figured those things out. But he's best well known for what's called classical conditioning. And just to give a preview of what classical conditioning is it's called what we call associative learning. So probably if many of you are like me, you walk into a dentist's office and you get a lot of anxiety, and the dentist turns on the drill, you get even more anxiety. That's associative learning. Okay. And so, but we'll get more specifics into this and how it works, and I'll provide more examples of classical conditioning, but that's just one example. But the thing that Pavlov was doing when he was learning about classical conditioning is he was doing experimentation on dogs. What he wanted to know is, based on the intensity or the smell of food, how much does one salivate? Is our salivation response when there's a strong scent of food versus a weak scent of food? And so what he did is and this is kind of the controversial part of him, is he surgically installed these vials and he stuck these vials in one of the dog's cephalic glands. Okay, so when the dog started to salivate, it would fill up that vial, and he could measure the amount the dog um, um, salivated. Now, at the time, it was assumed that you would only salivate, or you'd only get those hunger pains in the presence of the actual stimulus. Okay. But the myth goes is that as Pavlov was in the room, he noticed that when one of the experimenters walked in the room, that carrying the food, the dog would instantly start salivating without smelling the stimuli. And then he noticed after time that just the experimenter walking in the room, the dogs would start to salivate. So what he was interested in knowing is, why do dogs salivate when the presence of that food is not there? And as we will see, he uses novel stimuli and will give these labels about ringing the bell and the dog salivates and whatnot. So we'll get to this in more detail, but I just kind of wanted to give a background on who Ivan Pavlov was and why we ended up with a dog and bell example, so popular in psychology and memes on Facebook. Okay. The second person that we'll look at, or we'll actually probably we'll spend just a few more minutes on him when we get to this experimentation, is John B. Watson. Okay. And so John B. Watson, as I mentioned, was the father of behaviorism. He wrote the whole manifesto saying this is where we should go as psychology. But probably the most famous experiment that he is known for is what's called the Little Albert experiments. And we'll watch some short videos on this a little later when we get to associative learning. But what Watson wanted to prove is that fears and phobias are learned. They're not something that are innate to us. And so with Little Albert, he presented Little Albert, and we'll get more detail into this later. He would present Little Albert with a little white rat. Little Albert would do what infants do and try to put Little Albert in his mouth and just play with him. But then he started pairing Little Albert with a rat and then would do a loud noise behind his ear, which would do a startle response. And over repeated exposures, and again, we'll get more detail, he would then have a fear response with just the little white rat and not the loud sound. And then he generalized this to all little white things. Okay. Everything white and fluffy, he would have a fear response to. And Watson said, okay, here's evidence that fears are learned. And indeed, so we'll talk more about the ethics of this later on and about more details about the experiment little later on. But indeed, if you go into treatment and you're treating phobias and fears, it is reverse conditioning that is the best treatment. So if you have a fear of snakes, it's called exposure therapy. So what you're going to do is be exposed to images of snakes until you don't have a fear response, and then you end up in the same room with a snake until you don't have a fear response. But again, we'll get into that a little later, but it did develop into one of our better therapies for fears and phobias. Now, to finish, John B. Watson, you'll notice this lady in the back room. This is his graduate assistant. Rainier is her last name. And just to give us some interesting background on these two, they were actually having an affair during the Little Albert experiments. And afterwards, the university that he worked for said, either you break off your affair or you continue with the affair and you give your resignation. While Watson gave his resignation, divorced his wife, and married Rainier, which had two effects, I think. One, I feel bad for his wife. I think that was something kind of awful to do, but I should say this is a good example of how love can last. They were married very happily for I believe 30, 40 years. Rainier actually died 10 years before Watson did, and he supposedly spent the last 10 years of his life isolated in his house in loneliness and sadness. So we'll get to that when we get to intimacy and love later in the course. But the other thing he did is he went into marketing and advertising. Okay. And this is going to have two effects. One of the advertising and marketing is he's going to write one of our first quote unquote scientifically based parenting classes. based on the rules and the laws of operant and classical conditioning. In fact, he famously said, "Bring me your child. I'll make them into whoever you want them to be, an attorney, a garbage man, a doctor, a lawyer, whatever you want them to be, using the laws of classical and operant conditioning." And as we'll see next, B.F. Skinner took that to an nth degree in his experiments. But some of the effects of his parenting book is I'm sure a lot of moms have a lot of guilt because maybe their child didn't turn out exactly how they wanted them to be. That was one effect of Watson's parenting book because it put all of the onus of how a child turns out on the environment and the parent putting the stimuluses in the environment. And it really created a kind of cold relationship between children and parents, going clear up through the 1950s and into the 1960s. The other thing that well, Watson went into was marketing, and the first place that he was hired for was a coffee company who was losing share space in the marketplace for coffee. And at the time, if your product is not selling as good, the assumption is you have to do a better product. You have to make more quality of a product. And Watson kind of said, no, 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 you don't need to do that. What you have to do is make it look more appealing. And so in his experiment, he took their plain coffee can with just the plain lettering. And then he took another coffee can that had all this fancy stuff on it, these frills, mountains, all the things that you see on fancy coffee cans today. And their sales with the fancy coffee can tripled, whereas their regular coffee can stayed stagnant. And so what he proved is that you don't need to increase quality of a product, you just have to increase the quality of packaging. I call this the macaroni and cheese effect because I've heard a lot of people say Kraft macaroni cheese is a lot better than generic macaroni and cheese. Even though if you look and you go to the store and you look at the back of the box in the place where they were manufactured, most of the generic boxes were manufactured in the same place as your Kraft macaroni and cheese, but we swear that it's a higher quality. And that goes back to the Watson's idea that he came up with and had huge influence on marketing even up today. When you get your iPhone and it's in that fancy package, you think it's a higher quality than maybe it necessarily is. Okay, and so that's Watson. We'll talk about B.F. Skinner. Again, he's the one, he's really is going to bring out this anthropomorphization of animals, that animal behavior is very conducive to human behavior. His main approach is going to be using pigeons, and he's going to reward or punish these guys to see how quickly changes in behaviors or pecking speeds, as we'll see, increase based on a reward or a punishment. Okay. Now, I told you that B.F. Skinner took the whole idea that they could train children to the nth degree because he actually built what's called a child box. And his argument is just like his pigeons, he wanted to put children in these boxes and train them. And of course, ethics committee said absolutely not. And so he was going to use his own children. And this is kind of an interesting part of his story is Health and Human Services came in and said, no, you're not going to use your own children to do this. This is neglect and abuse, and you're not going to do this. So this idea was fortunately dropped from the beginning, even though he did build the box. The other interesting thing about B.F. Skinner is he actually was commissioned by the Defense Department to develop the first precision bomb using pigeons. And so the idea is again, using rewards and punishments. You put the pigeon in this little cone here, And what you do before the pigeon gets into the cone is you have them peck on the target. Okay. And then you put them in this little cone where they can see the actual target, and the pigeon would poke at the target, which would aim the bomb to where the target should hit. And so it would guide it in a sense based on where the pigeon was pecking, and lead it to its target. Now, interestingly, I think it's interesting anyways, we're willing to bomb human beings to obliteration and as innocent people to obliteration and harm other human beings. But people thought that this was so unethical that we would be willing to blow up a pigeon to blow up other human beings, that it was decided that not to use this program in the end in actual war. And so again, I think it's an interesting thing. We'll protect a pigeon, but we don't protect human beings. But just a kind of a thing on ethics. So this is B.F. Skinner's kind of interesting contributions to the field. And we'll get to him when we talk about operant conditioning. Does rewarding a child necessarily result in behavior change? And if we have time, we'll actually have you change someone's behavior. In one class where we had time, a student of mine actually conditioned his girlfriend to give him a hug, which was kind of fun. And so we'll kind of, maybe if we have time, we'll do that kind of experimentation in this class. All right. And then last, almost last people, we have two more that will kind of give as a preview to understanding learning is Albert Bandura. He came up with what's called the famous Bobo experiments, where on day one, a teacher would be setting up this Bobo doll where you hit it and then it comes back up. And he's going to have one aggressive teacher for some children who was really aggressive with the doll while she's building it, and then one teacher who is very calm. And then they measure the child's reaction the following day. And what Bandura found is children who had the violent or aggressive teacher the day before was very aggressive to the doll the day after. Those who had the calm teacher were not as aggressive and were not as violent. And this was probably the first example of things of continued experiments dealing with, does viewing violence actually increase aggression in children? Do violent video games, we see the experiments like this all the time. Does viewing violent video games increase aggression? What I'll say is, I'm going to leave this as a cliffhanger, is yes and no. Depends upon the situation and the context. But we'll get to that when we get to social learning about what does spur aggressive behavior in children based on learning. All right. And then the last person who I really think is an interesting fellow is Edward Tolman. And he's going to basically end the behaviorist movement by showing that little white rats develop what's called cognitive maps. So I want you to imagine that there's this maze, and you're walking by, this in a very prestigious university, and you look in this window, and there's this very prestigious uh, uh, professor, and he's has a little wagon, and he has a little white rat in that wagon, and he's pulling that wagon around a maze to see, because remember, in learning in this, you have to experience the behavior, operate on it in order to learn how to, for example, solve a maze. But these little experiment that Edward Tolman, and we'll get into more after that, pulling that little white rat around in that little maze to successfully get through that maze, he found with a few trials that the rat could actually walk the maze, even though they rode the wagon the first couple times, which came up with the notion of cognitive maps. We all have cognitive maps. Um, the reason why you can blindly almost drive to your work or to your home is because you already have a map within your brain. We can actually pinpoint the area of these maps with quite accuracy using scanning techniques. And there's actually a specialized area in the brain that stores your maps for places and things. So, but this kind of ended the idea that there's no mental life. We indeed have a mental life, and it's very important to us. Okay. Okay. So that was kind of a long and for some maybe a little bit boring conversation. So I'm going to kind of end class today with a video of what I think in a funny way will be about what we're going to talk about throughout this section when we're talking about these different types of learning.